December 28, 1944. 12 days into the Battle of the Bulge. American soldiers were dying in the snow at Bastogne, and General Dwight Eisenhower sat at his desk reading a memo that made his hands shake. Not from fear, from a cold, professional rage. The memo wasn't from the German High Command. It was from his own subordinate, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, and it contained a demand that was as insulting as it was shocking. Montgomery was demanding that Eisenhower relieve American commanders of the 1st and 9th Armies immediately, not for losing battles, for failing to keep their men's feet dry. Think about the timing. While the 101st Airborne was exhausted and battered from days of desperate fighting at Bastogne, their own ally was in a warm headquarters office, typing up an indictment of their leadership. To Eisenhower, this wasn't just a memo. It was a betrayal in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. Eisenhower read the memo again, hoping he had misunderstood. He hadn't. Montgomery was arguing that American generals were morally unfit to command because they couldn't manage basic soldier welfare. And behind this memo lay something even more dangerous. Montgomery was building a case to strip the United States of command authority over its own armies. Montgomery's memo was clinical in its contempt. American units were suffering from trench foot at epidemic rates, 3 times higher than British forces. More than 45,000 cases and counting. Men losing toes, feet, entire legs to frostbite. Trench foot isn't just a medical statistic. It's the agonizing, permanent tissue damage caused by weeks of exposure. It's a 19-year-old realizing he will never walk again because his commander prioritized ammunition over dry socks. When Montgomery viewed this as proof of amateurism, he wasn't just judging the generals. He was dismissing the misery of men in the mud. Montgomery argued this wasn't a supply problem. It was a leadership problem. British units operating in the same conditions with the same weather had 1/3 the casualty rate. The evidence was damning. American soldiers were eating K rations for 30 days straight, when the rations were designed for 3. They were sleeping in frozen foxholes without rotation. Their socks stayed wet for weeks. To Montgomery, this proved American generals were businessmen in uniforms. They moved resources around like factory managers, but ignored the professional craft that kept soldiers alive in the mud. War wasn't a corporate logistics exercise. It required discipline and grip that industrial might couldn't replace. But for Montgomery, this wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a political opportunity. He was using an epidemic of frozen American feet as a weapon to restructure the entire Allied command. Montgomery summarized his contempt in a way that cut deeper than any tactical criticism. He viewed the Americans not as professional soldiers, but as amateurs, businessmen in uniform who were playing at a game they didn't yet understand. While he was careful with his public words, his private diaries and memos to Churchill made one thing clear. He believed the Green American Command was a liability to the professional British war effort. The memo went to Churchill with a clear implication. If American commanders couldn't handle basic welfare, they shouldn't be trusted with strategic command. Montgomery wanted to formalize the temporary command he held in the North into a permanent British-led hierarchy. To a professional soldier, being viewed as an amateur isn't just an insult. It's a judgment that you lack the basic competence to do your job. And Montgomery was about to take this accusation directly to Winston Churchill. Montgomery's confidence was rooted in a British doctrine that treated soldier survival as a science. From mandated tea breaks to strict rotation schedules, the British system was designed for a nation that was simply running out of men. Most importantly, the British enforced strict discipline about preventive care. Dry socks weren't optional. Officers inspected soldiers' feet daily, Men who didn't maintain their equipment faced punishment. But there was another factor driving British doctrine. By 1944, Britain was running out of men. Every casualty mattered because there weren't unlimited replacements. The British couldn't afford to lose soldiers to preventable causes. This wasn't a lack of courage. It was a necessity of survival. The British soldier was a disciplined professional in a system designed to win an attritional war with dwindling numbers. Montgomery looked at American casualty rates and saw waste. A preventable casualty crisis when proper leadership could have stopped it. During some weeks in November 1944, American units had more non-battle casualties from trench foot than combat casualties from German fire. To him, this proved American generals were playing at war. Montgomery sent a private letter to Churchill in early January 1945. The letter was even more direct than his memo to Eisenhower. American generals were butchers who didn't know how to look after their men. Montgomery argued that the welfare crisis proved his broader strategic vision was correct. American aggression was causing unnecessary suffering, and the broad front strategy needed to be abandoned. His solution was simple. Give him command of all Allied forces north of the Ardennes, and give him their supplies. Montgomery wasn't just asking to lead American men. He was asking Eisenhower to take fuel and ammunition away from Patton and Bradley to feed the British advance. He was using welfare arguments to justify starving the American offensive. Churchill read the letter with growing alarm. He understood what Montgomery was really asking. He wanted to subordinate American armies to British command and claim credit for winning the war. But Churchill didn't shut it down either. He told Montgomery to be patient and let events prove his case. General Omar Bradley learned about Montgomery's memo within hours. The Allied command structure leaked like a sieve. Bradley's reaction was immediate and furious. He told Eisenhower he would rather resign before serving one more day under Montgomery's authority. Bradley was known as the soldier's general, though his own decisions at Hurtgen Forest haunted him. He carried the weight of every casualty notification. For Montgomery to suggest he didn't care for his men wasn't just a professional slight. It was a strike at Bradley's soul. Bradley wasn't angry about the welfare criticism. He was furious about the hypocrisy. Montgomery was lecturing about soldier care, while his own operations were burying British paratroopers. The man preaching about dry socks had just presided over one of the war's costliest disasters. Bradley made his position clear. If Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of American armies, Bradley would resign and make sure every newspaper in America knew why. George Patton's response to Montgomery's criticism was simpler and more brutal. He told his staff that Montgomery wanted American soldiers comfortable in trenches. Patton wanted them home by Christmas. The American philosophy was fundamentally different from British doctrine. American generals believed the most humane thing a commander could do was end the war as quickly as possible. 6 months of aggressive operations would save more lives than 2 years of careful welfare management. Patton didn't view trench foot as acceptable, but he viewed a stationary army as worse. To him, every day a soldier sat still was another day a German 88mm gun could find his range. Speed wasn't just a tactic, it was a life-saving measure. This meant accepting short-term hardship for long-term gain. American units pushed forward until they ran out of fuel. They ate K rations cold because hot meal trucks couldn't keep up with the advance. They slept in mud because stopping to build proper camps meant giving the Germans time to regroup. The statistics Montgomery cited were real. American units did have higher trench foot rates, but American units also advanced at speeds Montgomery's forces never matched. They covered ground in weeks that British operations took months to secure. Patton's Third Army covered 400 miles in 1 month during the breakout from Normandy. They liberated French cities faster than supply trucks could follow them. They reached positions the Germans thought would take months to threaten. This speed had a cost. Units outran their supplies constantly. Tanks sat idle, waiting for fuel. Soldiers ate whatever they could scrounge. The staggering medical toll Montgomery fixated on was partly the result of units moving too fast to establish proper camps. But the speed also shortened the war dramatically. Every week of rapid advance was a week the Germans couldn't use to build defenses. Every breakthrough prevented the Wehrmacht from stabilizing lines that would cost thousands of lives to breach later. American intelligence officers estimated that Patton's August 1944 advance alone shortened the war by 3 to 6 months. If Montgomery's methodical approach had been used instead, the war would have extended well into 1946. How many soldiers would have died in those extra months? How many more casualties would have resulted from attacking prepared German defenses instead of catching them in retreat? The math was brutal but clear. More than 45,000 cases of trench foot versus potentially hundreds of thousands of combat deaths from a longer war. The numbers destroyed Montgomery's entire argument. He pointed to more than 45,000 American trench foot casualties as proof of incompetent leadership. Those casualties were real, and they were preventable with better discipline. But every single one of those soldiers recovered. Trench foot wasn't fatal. Most men returned to duty within weeks. The casualties were temporary, painful, but survivable. Montgomery was using non-fatal injuries as evidence of moral failure. Now compare that to Market Garden. Montgomery's professionally planned operation that would end the war by Christmas. 17,000 casualties in 9 days, dead, captured, or permanently disabled. The 1st British Airborne Division was dropped at Arnhem with no realistic plan for relief. They held the bridge for 9 days against German armor. Less than 2,000 men escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The division ceased to exist as a fighting force. There is a haunting irony here. Montgomery was obsessed with the welfare of American feet, yet he had presided over the destruction of the finest paratroopers Britain ever produced. The men at Arnhem didn't need dry socks. They needed a plan that didn't abandon them to a meat grinder. Those weren't temporary casualties that could be prevented with better sock discipline. Those were men committed to an operation that had almost no chance of success. Professional planning had put British paratroopers into a killing ground. Who was the real butcher? The general whose men had cold feet but won their objectives? Or the general who dropped paratroopers into a death trap for a bridge that led nowhere? Montgomery never acknowledged this comparison. He continued to lecture about American welfare, while the heavy toll paid for his flawed operations exceeded anything American forces experienced from preventable injuries. Montgomery's memo was the opening shot. His January 7th press conference was the final insult. He stood before reporters and claimed he had saved the Americans at the Bulge. He described finding American forces in disarray and personally organizing the defense that stopped the German offensive. He talked about battles he had handled. Not battles the Americans handled. His battles. He was taking credit for soldiers who had fought and bled in the snow at Bastogne. The man who had lectured about dry socks was now stealing glory from the dead. The reaction was explosive. Bradley told Eisenhower this was the final straw. The alliance itself was on the verge of fracturing. Churchill was forced to intervene with a speech in Parliament on January 18th, praising American sacrifice and making clear the Battle of the Bulge was overwhelmingly an American victory. Churchill knew that while Montgomery was a brilliant tactical mind, he was a diplomatic disaster. The Prime Minister wasn't just saving Eisenhower's feelings. He was saving Britain's future relationship with the world's new superpower. Even Montgomery's own chief of staff, Major General Francis de Gingand, had to give him an ultimatum. Apologize to Eisenhower or lose your command. Montgomery was stunned. He genuinely believed he had been giving proper credit to Allied cooperation, but the damage was done. Montgomery had lectured Americans about caring for their men while presiding over Market Garden's destruction of British paratroopers, and now he was stealing credit for American victories won in the snow. The welfare argument was dead. The only question left was whether history would vindicate Montgomery's methodical approach or the American doctrine of speed at any cost. The final verdict came from the calendar. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Military historians have since calculated what would have happened if Montgomery's methodical approach had been used instead of American aggressive doctrine. If Allied forces had advanced at Montgomery's preferred pace, securing supply lines and rotating troops properly, the war would have extended into late 1945 or early 1946. The Germans would have had additional months to fortify defensive positions along the Rhine and in the Ruhr. Breaking those prepared defenses would have cost tens of thousands of additional casualties. Every week the war continued meant more V-2 rockets hitting London, more innocent lives lost to the horrors of the occupation, more cities destroyed by fighting, more families receiving death telegrams. American speed doctrine didn't just shorten the war, it determined how many people would survive to see liberation. The camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were liberated in April and May 1945. Extending the war by 6 months would have meant those camps continued operating through the fall. Every day of delay was measured in lives that could have been saved. In the spring of 1945, time was the only currency that mattered. For every day Montgomery wanted to wait for proper supply lines, the daily toll of lives lost in the camps continued to mount. For every hour, Patton's amateurs pushed through the night without sleep. A few more lives were snatched back from the brink. The American doctrine of accepting short-term hardship to achieve rapid victory was vindicated by this timeline. Yes, the frostbite crisis was significant, but hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home alive in May 1945 instead of dying in battles that never had to be fought. Montgomery's welfare doctrine would have kept British soldiers more comfortable in the short term, but it would have gotten far more men killed in the long term by extending the war. Montgomery prioritized a methodical, textbook advance. Professional SOC management wasn't more important than strategic speed. The most devastating verdict came from German generals interviewed after the war. They confirmed that American operational tempo prevented them from establishing defensive lines. Every time they tried to dig in, American forces were already pushing past their positions. German commanders like Model and von Rundstedt were often baffled by Montgomery's methodical pace, which gave them time to prepare defenses that cost thousands of Allied lives to break. If you ask a veteran of the Ardennes what mattered more, a hot meal in a trench or a ride home on a victory ship, the answer is obvious. Montgomery prioritized a war of methodical safety. The Americans prioritized a war of strategic speed. History doesn't remember who had the driest socks. It remembers who ended the nightmare.